I watched this over my 38-year career, going from fun enough, in the early 80s, where we thought the brain couldn't change. We had a better approach with mental health than we have now, where we know the brain can change. And I did some of the first neuroplasticity research in the world in my field in the 80s. And that was that time when I was told it was ridiculous. And it was only the mid 90s that people actually accepted that the brain could change. So it just shows you how recent it is. And so clinically, it's affected how people practice. So I've watched people going from having a holistic approach, looking at the person in context, their whole story, if someone's battling with whatever they're battling with, and also separating out things like, kind of looking at the whole person. So if you're battling with learning and you're battling with emotions, what happened? Not just lumping a label on because of the symptom. It was never, oh, you're battling with learning, you're battling with behavioral issues, and you're feeling very depressed. Okay, so you're clinically depressed, you have a learning disability, here's the medication. That's today. Then it was a narrative of, okay, well, let's look at the whole story. Let's bring in the whole team. What happened to you? How can we address that backstory? And that changed over the last 38 years with the advances of our understanding of the human brain, which we needed. With the advances in brain science, technology, medicine, this has taken us leaps into the future. But we paid a huge price, and I talk about that in the book too. And that huge price is that we've forgotten about the narrative of the person. And there's very few clinicians and people in the field, and I mean, Daniel, I mean, and myself and a few others are like, there's honestly, there's more now. But at one stage, there was, the going belief is that if you have depression, it's considered something like diabetes, and there's a chemical imbalance. And I mean, none of this is scientific. None of it's been proven. All of it is looking for some sort of neurobiological correlate that caused this depression. So it's like you've got this brain disease, and that's why you're depressed. No, you don't have a brain disease and that's making you depressed. You can have one and that can contribute, and there could be a tumor or something like that. But your mind is the overarching concept here. So you're a person who's experienced maybe trauma or abuse or whatever it may be, or COVID and grief and loss and financial. So when we're feeling mental health challenges, those are not illnesses. They are actually responses, and they are symptoms of an underlying issue, and they're warning signals that we need to listen to. And if we don't listen to them and we just stick a label on, and people take that on as their identity, it changes the brain, it changes the body, and I'll show you how in a moment. But what essentially that does is, in the context of psychology and in population statistics and what happens to humanity, is when you ignore a person's story and you don't allow a person to express and find the cause and the origin, what you do is remove a whole component of a person's functioning. You literally ignore 90% of how they're functioning. You focus just on the biological, which works great if you've got heart disease or something physically wrong with your body. But when we've got a story in our life, which all of us do have, we have to focus on that. So we see what we saw happening from the mid-90s, when neuroplasticity was at its sort of accepted and growing. We saw that leap in medicine, technology, neuroscience. We saw a backward movement, however, in mind. So people then started cutting out the story of mind and saying, well, we can't really measure it. So let's focus just on the biology. Let's make everything about the biology of the brain, and it's brain, and forget all about the experience. And that has resulted in a current trend that people don't talk about enough, but it's called deaths of despair. And what is happening now in our current age in 2021, and it started in 96 and it peaked, it was really identified between 14 and 15, and it's a massive problem currently, and that is that people are dying 8 to 25 years younger than they should from preventable lifestyle diseases and disorders. And that's tracked back to the mid-90s. So what I'm saying in total here is that for decades we've been improving the trend of people living longer. For decades people have been living longer because of advances, but that reversed in the mid-90s, and by the mid-2000s it was solid in science. So people are dying younger than they should with advances. There's a paradox, and we have to ask ourselves, how can that happen? It's contradictory. It doesn't work, but it is. And it's happening because of preventable stuff. preventable lifestyle diseases. So when we think of lifestyle, we think of food and diet and exercise, and stress management, and it's kind of a little category popped in there. But actually, each one of those things is driven by mind. So we've got to relook at the whole concept. It's not that mind is just part of a list of things. Mind is driving all those things. Your mind never stops for 3 seconds. We can go without food for 3 weeks. We can go without water for 3 days. We can go without oxygen for 3 minutes. We don't even go 3 seconds without our mind working. Your mind is the source of everything. So your mind is the source of what you choose to eat and the nutritional benefit you get from what you're eating. You can lose up to 80% of the nutritional benefit just by being in a toxic, unforgiving, or bitter or angry state, which affects your pancreas, for example, and it doesn't secrete neuropeptides that you should have. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. So your mind is driving your digestive system. Your mind drives the benefit that you get down to the level of your DNA out of exercise. Your mind is driving how you manage that next argument, that next podcast, that next interaction, that response to the news. Your mind is always working. So if we don't deal with mind, or we eliminate mind and just try and label people from a symptom, we are going to land up with what we have, people dying younger than they should. And mankind advancing with technology, but going backwards with who we are as humans. And that's where we are currently. And then COVID hit. That was already happening. And then COVID hit.
Right.
And COVID is forcing us to, it has added to the problem, but it's also forcing us to shift. And it's going to bring us back to the 70s and 80s and 50s and 60s, where we started looking at the human again. So it's had a very negative effect and a very positive effect. And not many people talk about the positive effect. So in conclusion to that question, was a long answer. When you identify with, if someone says you have clinical depression from a list of symptoms, and they diagnose, so symptom, 15 minutes, diagnosis, label, medication, or maybe a bit of therapy, or maybe a bit of both, you immediately change the way that your brain functions. You start your frontal, I'm just going to give you simple versions. For example, your frontal lobe, as soon as you get that kind of negative label, you get less oxygen and blood flow to the front of your brain, literally immediately. Your identity gets stuck in being in a very negative identity. So that creates imbalance between the two sides of the brain. So identifying with a toxic label that doesn't actually make sense will affect the functionality of your ability to make decisions and think with cognitive flexibility, and right down to the level of impacting intelligence. And I show that in my research. When you actually show a person how to shift their identity and not see themselves as a label. So instead of saying, I am depressed, like that's me, I've got clinical depression, you rather say, to help them to see, empower them to see that, no, you aren't depression. You're experiencing depression, which is totally okay, totally understandable. And if you grab that depression and look at it, you'll find a message in the depression. You are simply responding in a normal way to an adverse circumstance. When you change that, you change everything about the brain, the body, right down to the level of the telomeres. So there's another long answer.
Yeah.